All right, I'm going to kick the meeting off and give everybody a chance to settle back in. But we are officially back in session. All right, item 8.2 on the agenda is a discussion of the progress being made on the school start time question. And Dr. Smyser, I'll turn that over to you again.
So we're moving forward. We have great information. We have a great community committee that you're going to hear about who's helping us. A lot of the information you're going to get tonight and see in the coming months is coming from this committee, which is nice. And just to shake it up and have someone different, we have, oh wait, it's Scott.
Thanks again. It's nice to be back up in front of you. I'm excited to talk about the work we've been doing in looking at school start times. I think if you go up, it's probably about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, where the board asked us to take a look and study the idea, the options to look at start times differently than we look at them currently. And so we've put a considerable amount of time into this. Many individuals from across the district have worked hard to try to build our understanding, our knowledge, and look at what scenarios are. So we look forward to sharing some of the work and what we're going to bring forward. As many of you remember, you asked us to look at this. We're exploring the possibility of a 1920 shift in start times. Obviously, as we come before you later this fall, be looking at 1920 and obviously looking at you to make a decision as to what makes sense. What kicked it off, I think, for you, but also for us, was what research continued to tell us. And in this case, the American Medical Association recommends that high school students don't start any earlier than 8:30, but there's a body of evidence that continues to say the same thing. And for those of you listening on the website, under school start times, there's much of that research referenced if anyone wants to go dig into it. And currently, our start times for our secondary schools range between 7:25 and 8:15. So that felt important for the community to recognize. We also recognize that this conversation has a broad impact. And so without thinking about that, there is a broad impact on individuals and collective groups, positively and negatively. But whenever you move systems, there's impacts. And we've tried to look at many of those as we bring some scenarios forward, but that's important to recognize. So we began the exploration with survey. We talked briefly about that. I can't remember what month I talked to you about that, but 6-8 months ago we talked about the survey results. We had a high response rate, over 17% of those that we sent it out to. 85% of those that responded were favorable to high school students starting later. That helped us, I think, move forward, that many of them looking at what they had, that made sense to them. In all cases, at all three levels, if you remember the survey data, the ideal start times were between 8 and 8:30. One of the things we recognize as a committee quickly is that's not achievable without lots and lots of money, because we're a large district with a huge area that we serve. So we were creative around how we use time, and you'll see that here in a few minutes. Another concern that popped up in the survey where there were lots of people who supported the later start time, there's concern about the end time for high schoolers. How far in the day do high schoolers end in school? And then you start thinking about the add-ons out the end. So that was a concern we saw from many, and much of that pertained to the homework, the extracurricular activities, the jobs, those things that go on in the evening, and how much do we interfere with those was a theme that we saw in that survey. We also saw that when you make a change, we impact the individual families, and you saw that as you went through the survey data. You saw that represented many times. I would say that you also saw in the survey that individual impact and the collective impact. And it was interesting, you could almost see in the survey feedback the wrestling that those responding might have been thinking about, the good of the group and the impact on the individual, and that makes sense, and I think we'll likely see some of that information when we get the second survey back as well. Start and end times for staff should be something we take into consideration, and as we've looked at other districts, we see that they're learning from their shift. How did that impact the impact on the staff, and where their start and end times, how they shifted. And in some cases, the elementary teachers who start late get to start early, and then they're done early. And in some districts, the middle school teachers that started early are now starting late and are done later. There's an impact to your flow of your work, and so something for us to think about, at least as we go through it. And that you asked us as we went through this to consider research as we looked at what decisions we brought forward, and we feel like we've done that. We did pull together a committee. That committee was represented by parents from all three grade levels, elementary, middle, and high. We had community members at large. We had an individual who represented Base Camp. That was a great resource to have on that committee. We had another individual that was a sleep expert. That was intriguing to have on the committee. We also had some individuals that had polling expertise and survey writing expertise. So all of that helped us, I think, both interpret Survey 1, move through what we were trying to do, and build Survey number 2. And then in addition, we had licensed, classified, and administrative staff from all the different areas in town, all the different feeders represented, and all the different employee groups were represented on the committee. The objectives that we put in front of the committee, that we felt like we took from a charge you gave us, were to consider the feedback from that first survey data, and to look at information from the transportation department, and to use the information to identify 3 to 4 start time scenarios for further consideration to put out in the second survey and also in our community engagement sessions that will happen in the month of September. We thought it was important as we talked about this tonight to talk a little bit about some background information for transportation. That we covered 1,900 square miles, and I wish I could compare that to something else. Maybe, Matt, you can tell me how big that really is. It's big. So that's about as where I am. It's big. We run 1,600 runs with 128 routes in a 3-tiered system. So we have kind of an early, a middle, and a late system. Each bus that we purchase is about a $100,000 expense. You know that. You've seen that as we bring that in front of you annually, looking at buying new buses. And it's about $37,000 annually to run that bus. And so as we considered scenarios and growth, you'll see that's where our figures in terms of the cost of the ongoing transportation comes from, is the cost of the bus as well as the driver to drive the bus. Although I will say that if Christine ends up getting her license, that will be an extra bus driver you have in town that can help us. She better not get her license then. Might be harder. The tiered system allows us to be efficient. That's where we moved to that. Matt, how many years ago did we move to the tiered system? The idea, we cut a lot of routes, a lot of buses out of the system at the time. So that's a model that allowed us to become more efficient, streamline, have more money that's flowed out for other things we're doing in the system. And so that tiered system provides that work for us. Hiring and retaining bus drivers is an ongoing task. It's an ongoing challenge. And as the job market gets tighter, it could become more of a challenge. And so Matt and his team do a great job of trying to bring bus drivers in. And we raised the hourly wage for our bus drivers mid-year last year. And they're now one of the highest paying districts in the state, I think is true, right? And so that's in an effort to try to continue to pull in drivers but retain drivers. And it is certainly was a part of the conversation in each of the scenarios we looked at, because if you start thinking about 16 extra routes, 16 extra drivers, when we have a hard time with what we have, that becomes a burden, and not to mention the upfront cost, but the ongoing cost and risk in not having enough drivers is certainly something to take into consideration.
Scott?
Yeah.
One of the questions we got, I think from Rob and from others, is what's your annual amount of new routes that you add just due to growth, so that we can see the difference between new drivers that we would need due to growth every year versus if we change start times?
Would you please approach the microphone?
So for the last 3 years, we've added 3 routes per year. This year we did net 3. We did some shuffling within the system, or I'm sorry, we didn't net 3. We netted 2. Just due to some shuffling and some rerouting, we were able to only add 2 this year. But you'll see in the study and in some of the numbers that you see, that does include 3 growth routes every year for however long we sustain this growth in our area.
Nate?
Yeah, I think we had a question by email from Rob. Can you address some of the reasons that we tend to need to continually hire new drivers, and what turnover and what some of the reasons are, or is there a pattern?
So we started studying this last year. We went back 2 years and started looking at reasons that we knew of. We're in the process of developing an exit interview for the transportation department so that we can track a little more closely. The resignations and the ones that left over the past 2 years, it's been a wide array of things. There's not one key thing I could tell you that has caused that. We've had everything from retirements to health issues, to better paying jobs, or just a career change. It's really all over the map. There's no key thing there. It did help that the district was able to raise the salaries. That hourly rate did make a difference, especially in retention is what we found. But we're also seeing that our applicants went up. We had a period from October through January that we were constantly posting the position, and we had like 4 applicants during that whole time. Once the hourly rate went up, we ended up, for the summer class, we ended up having about 50 applicants for our summer class, which we started with 21 people. And so it was a big success. Along with that, HR helped us do some job fairs. The job fairs were a great success. We set them up where people could actually come in and drive a bus around a parking lot. We didn't get them out in the street. We left them in the parking lot. But that was there was a lot of enthusiasm that came with that, and it was really neat to see. And we had a lot of people like, oh, that's not so bad after all. Yeah, I think I am interested. You know, it kind of dawned on that they could do this, so that helped. But HR was great in helping get those settled. So, yeah, recruitment and retention right now is a concentration that we're going on, trying to really hammer.
A couple other questions. So if you put like most of those 21 drivers in the summer class into the pool, will you still be short, or will you be about even?
So right now, starting on Friday morning, basically, we'll be subbing 10 routes.
Okay.
So trying to figure out how many drivers we're short is kind of like playing the lottery right now, trying to find that number, because it changes daily. It actually changed today again. So if right now I'm 2 drivers short for routes. So route drivers I'm short. Overall, I'm about 6 drivers short, which includes our lead positions, which we're trying to fill. If we fill those from our pool of route drivers, then that's how those routes kind of, again, now I'm short route drivers again. We do have another class that's starting middle of September. We're taking applications now, and we're getting a very good response on the application rate. And we're doing interviews right now. So it looks like we had a goal of 8 to 10 in that class, and it looks like we'll meet that goal pretty easily. So things are good in that area. I mean, I just, yeah, again, thank you and thank the district for that hourly rate increase. I do think that helped quite a bit. And then the advertising that we're able to do and making the job more attractive, so.
Okay, thanks. The other question is in terms of the daily and monthly driver hours, do you still do a rating of like 5.75 hours? If they average that, they're eligible for full benefits?
That is correct. Yeah.
5.75 hours a day.
5.75 is our level that you have to meet to get benefits. And we're able to do that. Any employee that really wants to meet that level, you know, the route may be 4 hours a day, but we have such a big growth and a big need for activity and field trips in this district that by doing a few trips a week, they can meet that average pretty easily.
And is it relatively easy to go beyond that if they want to basically almost be full-time?
Yes.
As well with trips and other things?
We have many drivers that actually will go to 40 hours a week.
Okay, thanks.
The last thing I would say on this slide is that practice, and you, Matt, has worked hard. I know Vicki and her team have worked hard to help, but the idea that everybody we have with the CDL license over in transportation drives quite a bit. And so when you think about a sustainable practice, that's a tough one. So we'll continue to work on that and see if we can't get Christine to help out just a tiny bit. So we, as a team, as a committee, went through many scenarios. One of the things we learned fairly quickly is they're endless. There are many different scenarios. We worked hard through the month of May and June and landed on 4, one of which is our current scenario, our current start times. We have scenario A, which moves our start times for high schools to 8:30, and for most middle and elementary schools stays the same. Scenario B, which moves our high schools to between 8:55 and 9. The middle schools in this scenario move slightly. They move to 8:05, and the elementary schools move from between 7:45 and 8:50. And then scenario C moves the high school slightly later, 9 o'clock to 9:05, allows the middle schools to slide to 8:35, and keeps the elementary start time at 7:45, but limits the gap to just 7:45 to 8:40. So I'll go through each of the scenarios in a little bit more detail. If you think about, I'm going to say kind of pros and cons if we start thinking about these scenarios. The current start time is obviously earlier than the research, which is why you've asked us to study this. Maintains not any change really throughout the system. There's very little change for any of our families or any of our teachers. And in that process, as Matt just talked about, we still look at the need for 3 new buses, which would cost $411,000 in year 1, with an ongoing cost of $111,000. And you'll see that as we talk about each scenario, that idea of $411,000 is built into the other 3 scenarios, so that we've figured growth is built into each of the other ones as we started talking about them. If we go to scenario A, that is that scenario that I talked about, moves our high school start times to that sweet spot of 8:30, with limited to no change for middle or elementary schools. High schools end up starting about an hour later, and that aligns perfectly for the high schools with what research says, that 8:30 start time is a good spot, not to start them sooner than that. Middle school start times would stay the same with the exception of CLP, which travels with Poudre High School. So CLP middle school would move back to that 8:30 start time, or they'd be a little before 8:30 because they get dropped off before Poudre. But they would certainly change from their early start time right now. I think right now they're 7:25, so they're very early right now at CLP middle. This option is the least impactful for your middle and elementary schools. 5 elementary schools change a bit, and then I talked about CLP already moves slightly. High school end time shift to about 4 o'clock. Obviously, that one of the considerations for us as we move to that model is thinking about how does that impact the activities, the jobs, those things that we talked about earlier. And then the cost of scenario A is $822,000. So that's double the current. So it's adding 3 extra routes, or buying 6 buses total. And it's $222,000 ongoing cost. So that gives you a sense of it's twice what it would be to stay with the current. Scenario B, if we move to that, moves our high school time to 8:55, between 8:55 and 9 o'clock. So it moves our high schools back an hour and a half. That continues to be in alignment with what the AMA recommends, this idea of not starting before 8:30. I also think was one that the board asked us to think about. How do we flex what we're thinking about and not get stuck in thinking 8:30 to 8 o'clock was perfect? This is an example, I think, that we took that recommendation and tried to figure out how might that work. It allowed us to move middle schools to 8:05, which is a little closer to what the AMA recommends, but doesn't get them to the 8:30 sweet spot. And our committee, I will tell you, wrestled with your middle school students. Are they in the same boat as the high school in terms of sleep, or are they elementary students? And the reality is they're both. You have some in the middle school that are still in the sleep patterns as elementary students, and you have some that are in that adolescent phase where they're ready to sleep in until 10:30. They're going to bed later. Their brains are have moved or have shifted, and so you have both in the middle school level. So was something that came up in our committee quite a bit, actually, as we talked about the middle students. Christoph.
So when the committee was discussing that, one of the things that came into my mind with these scenarios, is there a chance that we would do something, one of these scenarios, and then 10 years from now feel we're going to go back to parents saying the AMA expects you to sleep in and we're going to have to go through it again? Or do you think these are, I don't know, it's an open-ended question, and I don't know how you would answer it, but were you guys talking about that kind of thing? Are each of these scenarios ones that are going to stick? Maybe that's a simpler way to ask it.
Well, that's a hard question, I think, to answer.
I apologize, yeah.
No, it's a good question to ask. I think it's a fair question because it is a big change. I think that what you're seeing from districts that are moving, many of them report lots of benefits. I think science is hard, though, right? Because we continue to learn. And so what will science be telling us in 10 years? It's certainly different than when we looked at this 10 or 12 or 15 years ago. We know a lot more about sleep and the brain and learning now than we did 10 or 15 years ago. So likely we'll know more in 10 or 15 years. I will tell you one of my wonderings is, whose phone is that? No, just kidding. Is what's the ramifications, if any, on the elementary school students? Because we haven't studied that. They've in many districts have been the later start. So do we find out 5 or 10 years? The research that I've seen initially from Cherry Creek is pretty positive about the outcomes for elementary students and elementary staff in their change. But I think it's open to question. I think it's a wondering, right? Where do we land and what do we learn? And are we nimble enough to take a risk, make a decision, whatever that decision is, and 10 years down the road say, the results weren't what we wanted them to be. We need to look at what the options are. I think that's true with any decision you make, any risk you take. It's not status quo. And if you stay status quo, do you watch everybody else around you make the change? And 10 years later, you say, we should have planted the tree 10 years ago. So,
and I apologize. I realize there's no great way to answer it, but I do wonder how much it came up in discussions.
We wrestle with that a bit, and when you have all the different representatives on the committee, you have a lot of different angles, and some positive and some negative. So we had good dialogue around that and many other questions.
I would just like to add that I hope we have the courage to consider and maybe make a decision to try this, and just because we did it doesn't mean we need to be stuck with it if it doesn't work. So I think it would be a shame to make a decision based on the fact that we might have to modify it later.
I think that's leadership, Nate. You're right. I think that's what the courage to make the decision, I think, is that, right? That's right.
And if I may, I think maybe another way to phrase the question is, are each of these scenarios ones that, and I realize you haven't made it through, so I kind of interrupted in the flow, but are each of these scenarios that we are comfortable presenting? If, and I don't know how to answer, you could possibly answer that, but were any of these committee members going, yeah, we can put this on there, but that's not going to work, kind of thing?
These were the 4 scenarios that were the most popular with the committee.
Okay.
So as we analyzed that, these were the 4 most popular.
Nate, keep going back and forth, and I think Carolyn wants to jump in as well, so.
Well, I guess, so any of the scenarios we think would be feasible. Is that what we're saying? Is that kind of what you were saying? I mean, or
They are all feasible. They are all, and I mean.
Maybe reasonable would be.
Yes, they're all reasonable. The committee felt like could work.
okay, thanks.
And then I just wondered if you had talked to Weld County or to Greeley to see how they have been doing so far, because they did change over last year, and I just wondered will those be their second year that they're in?
Yeah,
with
this will be their second. What we know is they've made some changes in transportation. They've gone back. Last year they changed transportation and essentially took away high school busing, as I recall, and have moved back to high school busing this year. So that's an example, I think, of they made a decision that they moved out of in fairly rapid form. We've had some conversations with Thompson, who's about a year ahead of us, and some of the challenges they're experiencing right now. And we've had more dialogue with Cherry Creek because they're out a couple of years. And in terms of and they've got formal data that we've been able to see. So Cherry Creek's one we've talked to more than Weld, and we'll continue to learn from other constituents for sure.
Kathy.
Since we're interrupting your flow anyway on the same topic, what did Cherry Creek do for start times for middle school? Where did they land? Did they land in sort of a medium position? Or?
No, they ended up with middle schools later. So their high schools, I believe, are like 8:35, and their high school or middle schools are 5 to 9, I think. Cherry Creek's interesting in the sense that they're demographically or I guess geographically smaller than we are. So everything for them is tighter in. I think their elementaries are shortly after 8, I think, and their high schools are right around 8, that 8:30 time slot. And the middle schools are later, so their middle schools went out of the chutes third. And ours fit better as we're doing it in the middle slot. Yep.
Nate?
So are you saying that Cherry Creek has fewer transportation conflicts than a larger district?
Not sure I'm equipped to answer that, but Matt might be able to.
Do we not know? Okay, we don't know. Okay. All
I
right.
just know they're small. I mean,
Yeah,
geographically, they're not nearly 1,900 square miles.
Sure. Okay.
Carolyn.
Just so we can understand some of the issues with how long kids have to stay on the bus, I think we asked this question once before, but I think it bears asking it again. The kids that we have who are riding the bus the longest, I mean, how long are our kids riding the bus? What's the longest route we have?
So the longest route we have would initiate at Red Feather schools. Those students that live in the Red Feather area board the bus at about 5 till 6 right now at Red Feather School. And they transition to a bus about halfway down the hill and go to Livermore and transition to another bus and then come to CLP, and then they get to Pooter on another bus. So they have about 3 times they have to change buses to do that. I don't believe any of these scenarios change that dramatically. We did try to avoid making those bus rides longer. I mean, that was definitely a thing that we did focus on. And I don't believe that they'll be any longer. They'll be a little later, but they won't be any longer and possibly not any shorter.
One of the things that we were able to do in the three scenarios was disconnect, and I can think, CLP stays on the bus with Pooter, but one that's currently riding middle school and high school is Preston, and that's disconnected in the scenario B, C, A, B, and C, I believe. And so that shortens the bus ride for the Preston kids. So there's a group of students that right now ride with the Fossil students, drop off Fossil, then go to Preston, and then reverse that in the afternoon. So there's a group that would shorten up. In this scenario, we flip and we go elementary early. And so we have elementary schools, the start times, we have 10 elementary schools that end up starting at 7:45. And that's the same time that iStone currently starts. There was a question, I think it was from Rob, that asked about the committee's feeling about 7:45 being the right start time. And we had some scenarios that were as early as 7:35, and unanimously felt like that just felt too early. There's no putting we didn't have any research that told us that, but just as you talked to the representatives on the committee, all of us felt like 7:35 was too early. It was hard for us to say 7:45 was too early when we have a school starting at 7:45 currently. So it was hard to say that's too early for elementary. So that became as far back as we were willing to go with elementary start times. High school end times shift to about 4:25. Again, you look at the impacts, the same potential impacts as before, the activities, athletics, jobs, internships. How does that manifest? How do we take care of that? How do we learn from what other districts are doing? There are other districts that are using this model of starting that late, and so there's hurdles for sure. But that's where we landed as a positive for the flip. This particular scenario, we would be adding 5 routes. Remember, 3 of them are for growth and 2 of them would be for this scenario, for a total of $685,000 in year 1 and $185,000 of ongoing cost. The third scenario moves the high school start time about 5 minutes later. And so they're again moving back about that hour and a half, which supports what's recommended. The middle schools, this allows them to move back to 8:30, which aligns the middle schools with that 8:30 recommendation. Flips the elementary again and has this time 9 schools starting at 7:45 instead of 10. The high school end time shifts from 4:25 to 4:30. And again, you have the same stuff to think about in terms of what happens after school for our high schools. I will say when Cherry Creek moved theirs, they were pretty adamant about only a couple of things could happen before school, and it was hockey and swimming, which already is happening before school. And right now, hockey isn't here, but swimming, you see them every year come before you, and those swimmers are swimming every day at 4:30 in the morning. Cherry Creek made a decision on the front side. Those are the only things that could go in the morning. I think as we go down the path, we would have to ask ourselves the question, how much activity would we allow to be in a 0-hour type approach? How much flexibility would we want to build into that, particularly when you start looking at a 4:30 end time? If you're 4:30 end time and you got a chunk of your students that did practice beforehand, and I recognize that washes out this idea of what the recommendation is for school, but it's a select group instead of everybody. So as you're analyzing the information, that's a question for us to think through. This particular scenario has us adding 8 routes. Again, remember, 3 of them are for growth, so it's 5 extra for the scenario, for a cost of almost $1.1 million up front, and about $300,000 ongoing cost to run this scenario. Any specific questions on the 4
Nate.
scenarios?
I guess when you mentioned the question about what to do with 0 hour. Is it the case? I thought I heard something about Cherry Creek saying, since we're going later, we're not playing until later. So it's not like everyone else is going to go until 4:30, but we're going to put high school football players on a bus at 2 p.m. to come up to Fort Collins. I thought there was some line in the sand that they drew about trying to respect the later release time.
Yeah, they had, what I've seen is mixed results. That some of the schools in the conference worked with them around start time, and others it was negative. They didn't feel like they controlled it. I think the games they could control, they were able to make some headway on. But District AD down there said there clearly is no way to say they're missing less time from school when they moved it back. So that's what's come out of Cherry Creek. I think what's interesting for us in any of the scenarios, keeping the middle school students where they are, might mean our middle school athletics doesn't get impacted all that much in any of the scenarios we use. Even when you're thinking they get done with school at 3:30, that's moving their practices back a half hour as opposed to where Cherry Creek is, which they moved them back to 9 o'clock. So our middle school athletics, which for us means the most athletics or a lot of athletics that's outside with no lights and no ability to be out past whenever the sun goes down, not moving middle school athletics might help us a little bit more than if our middle schools were later. That might have more negative impact in our middle school. But they were pretty clear in Cherry Creek that there is time being missed from school because they were not able to move all the start times back. But they have had some success with it. And I believe one of the things I heard their superintendent say last year was they're out pounding the pavement because the more districts that move, the more common it will be to have athletic start time shifted.
If you keep in mind that if it's a home game and we're not out of school, the team that just arrived can just wait till we get out of school and we play. But
Right.
when we're going to their turf, we have to show up and play at the time that they play because they're home.
Krista?
And out of curiosity, do you happen to know what proportion of districts are making this change at this point? I mean, is there any, I hear all these names, so it sounds like a lot, but is it 10% of them, or is this just a trend and in 10 years
don't-
everybody will be moved?
I don't know that I could say a percentage, but each year you hear more districts that are looking at it or have made the change. And there's some big districts right now studying it like we are across Colorado. So, and like I said, Cherry Creek has been pretty vocal, and they present often about to other groups around what they're doing and now what they're finding. So that's their way of influencing other people.
But in our area, we know Weld has made and I can't remember how many Weld districts there are, but the majority of Greeley is changed over, and Thompson Valley has changed over, and we know now that some of the Denver schools are changing
Yep.
over. Okay.
Thompson's going this fall, so they'll start.
They're going this
Yeah.
fall, okay.
To add on to that, so I'm just not sure how many of those other districts do we play in sports activities. So if have most of the games that we play, are we playing against districts that have already changed?
Now, some of the sport that's the worst for travel right now, Matt may correct me as I say this, but the sport that's the worst for travel is football. And it's really, it's a hodgepodge in who we play. They're not close. They've done kind of an odd thing with how they set up the districts for football. I will say Chasa's looking at that. They've got feedback because it's expensive for all the districts around the state, that the model they shifted to forces, or just around transportation, has put a lot of burden on many districts around the state. So they're looking at that. So I don't think I could answer tonight. I could get the answer around how many of our districts, how many districts do we play, have already made the move or are looking at it.
I'd also say that the smell of football is also the worst. I'm surprised that this district doesn't pay a bonus for drivers that even from French Field back to Fort Collins High Schools is very difficult.
That feels like time to move on to the next slide. So, as I talked about, we started, and one of the things we did the first couple times we were together was brainstormed scenarios, looked at scenarios, and then let the committee kind of finagle and ask questions, and then say, hey, we've got an idea, can we run this? And so Matt would be brave, I guess, and his group was awesome in that they would run scenario after scenario, and they'd be able to come back and, on the transportation side, talk to us about, can we do it? And the answer was almost always yes, and then there was a cost. And so one of the examples we had was a 8:15 a.m. high school start time that was, I'd say, quasi-popular, but cost almost $3 million in startup cost, and then the ongoing cost was pretty prohibitive also. I think it was almost $1 million a year annually to run that scenario. I talked already about the 7:35 start time. We had several scenarios that moved the elementaries back to 7:35, but was challenged for the committee to wrap their arms around 10 elementary schools starting at 7:35, which meant we were going earlier than we go already, and that felt like a hard sell to get elementary families to say we're going earlier than any elementary kids are today. We had one scenario that was 8:45 for the high school start times, with the middle school starting 15 minutes later than they do today, and elementary schools starting between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, so it kept the elementaries kind of in that sweet spot. And again, it cost over $2 million to pull off too, with an ongoing cost of, I believe it was about $650 million, or $650,000 annually. So,
Nate?
I guess that reminds me of something I was wondering, and obviously the ability of the transportation department to hire enough staff is going to be a variable, but even with the +8, I'm wondering if that's feasible, because, and we won't know until we try it, but if you have to hire 5 in addition to the growth of 3, and you're always 5 down, then I don't know how that works, but
I will say that one of the things the committee wrestled with was what dollar signs are too much. So an example is $2 million in startup money too much? And the committee would wrestle for a little while, and then somebody would say exactly what you just said, Nate. It's not just about the money. It's about, we've got to find this number of drivers, and are we putting ourselves in a pickle by saying we've got to have 15 or 18 new drivers, and then consider growth, because we're going to do this in whatever year we move, and then we're going to add 3 drivers the next year and 3 drivers the following year. And so the committee was, I think that came up a lot, the committee was responsive to the challenge that we would have if we decided to go with a scenario that required lots of drivers.
And I guess another question I would have is, what's the diminishing return about increasing the wage, the per hour wage? Because when we learned last year that we went to $17.50, that might have helped, and now we're over 18, and it's a big responsibility. But my question is, what is the pool we're trying to draw from? I mean, we can't really compete with the oil and gas industry in terms of pay, so I don't know if we're necessarily competing with them to a large extent. But at what point does raising the wage rate not gain us anything in terms of attracting more drivers? And we don't necessarily have to. If you want to address that, you can, but you don't need to.
I don't mind addressing it, because I think it comes up a lot as, what is the magic number? And I don't know where that is. I mean, of course, I'm always going to promote, more pay for the bus drivers. That's great. Where is that limit, and can we compete, and who are we competing with? A lot of times we hear we're competing with the oil fields. That's a yes and no, because yes, they're looking for CDL drivers too, but a lot of their vehicles are meeting the weight rating where they have to have Class A's. A bus driver is a Class B. So are they really taking our drivers? And that's hard to say because, you know, they have some Class B vehicles, but a lot of times they're looking for a Class A driver. So I don't know that we're losing a lot to the oil fields. I can tell you I only know of 1 or 2 people in the past 3 or 4 years that's left to go drive a water truck in the oil fields. So I don't know that that's really our competition. But you see other signs around town of, you know, plumbing companies, they're wanting Class B drivers. You see other industries, UPS, delivery vehicles, you know, all those smaller vehicles that you see that are kind of the same size as our warehouse vehicles, those are Class B vehicles. So that's where our competition is. And those hourly rates, again, it's a wave. You don't know where they're at. It depends on the company, you know, and a lot of it depends on benefits. I think the fact that PSD offers such a great benefit package is very attractive to a lot of our people, and we actually hear that. You know, that's a concern of theirs is, man, if I lost my benefits, this would be horrible. And they would probably move to somewhere they could get benefits. So that's a big attraction for PSD. So I think, you know, again, I don't mean to be vague or like I'm avoiding the question, but I don't know that we have any of that really nailed down, and I'm not sure how to get there. You know, we're doing our best to collect some data, and we'll see what we get, but right now I don't have it.
Okay, I appreciate that. The other thing is I would highlight what you said about offering benefits. I mean, a district south of us, as I understand it, makes gradations of the amount of benefits that they're eligible for, and I like the idea of just having a set rate, either you're eligible or you're not, and it seems like it's a lot easier for everyone if we have that, and it's great that we're doing it. So I appreciate that that's an attractive part of our package.
All right, talking about next steps. We have worked hard on the scenarios, obviously talking about them publicly tonight. We will go out to the community through September. I think there's 4 Thursdays in September. We'll be at one of the high schools each of those Thursday nights doing community comments. So for those who are out there listening, come hear about late starts in a little more detail at the community engagement sessions. And so we're looking forward to that. We will be releasing the survey late in August. And again, for us, that will run, it will be open late August all the way through September. The idea would be if I want to wait to take that survey till after I've been to a community engagement, I can do that. And so that's the way we've initiated the response. We also will be talking, we talked earlier tonight about this topic with DAB. We've already talked to DAB about this being an October agenda item for 2 reasons. One is we get to meet the DAB and do our first work with them in September, but we also talked to them about the fact that that allows them to be part of community engagement sessions. We've talked with them about advertising so that when they come to the October DAB meeting, our hope is that at least some subset of that group also participated in community engagement. And then we'll do some of that with them that evening as we look to gain feedback from that group for the board. As I said, September 6th, 13th, 20th, and 27th, we'll be out at the high schools. The first 3, the 6th at Fort Collins High School is at 5:30. The 13th is at 5:30 at Poudre High School. The 20th will be at Fossil Ridge High School at 5:30. And the 27th is the oddball, will be at Rocky Mountain High School at 6 o'clock. And then our plan is to pull together all the information we have from the surveys, the feedback we've heard from DAB that you have, and to come back in front of the board to present our findings in November. And we'd love to see a decision at the December meeting would be fantastic. I will say the earlier the decision's made, the earlier we can communicate the decision's been made, and the more time we'll have to make sure the decision works well. And we'll see, that's critical, right? The earlier we can communicate what the decision is, the better off we'll be.
Okay, questions, Nate?
Are you saying that even a month will make a big difference terms
Yeah,
of decision?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
December versus January is a month we have a chance to think about the work we have to do. But yes, there will be a lot of work to do, unless you decide you're staying current. If the decision is to stay current, there's no work to do. But in any of the other three scenarios, making sure we work with the principals, work with communities, make sure we understand what we're doing, to mitigate all the change in the system. And there'll be a lot of change in the system with any of scenario A, B, or C. All of it doable, but the more time we have to move through and do it well, the better off we'll be.
So in light of that, are there board questions, concerns with regards to these next steps? And there's been a lot of discussion behind the scenes over the last year about how we're doing this. Kathy?
It's not really a question. I just wanted to say thank you to the staff, you guys, and all of our community members who came and volunteered their time to serve on the Later Start Times Committee, or I think I got the name wrong, but for this committee, because it's really huge to have community members step up and participate at the district level. So thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. I will say our community members were fantastic.
Nate?
Well, I wanted to ask, in terms of like the survey release and the community engagement sessions, other than the community members, parents that would normally get those communications, how are we getting the word out for either of those? And, you know, how's the marketing to people that might not otherwise get emails?
So we're going to do a couple different things. We're going to do a social push, so you can do a paid push on Facebook, and you can do it by geographic, or you can do it by age, or you can do it by household. So we do quite a few different ones of those based on the demographic we're trying to reach, and we've had really good success with that. So we'll do a social push, and we'll obviously work with the Coloradoan to get it out to their subscribers, to those who may not receive our emails. We also send it out to our key communicator list, which has over 1,100 people on it that do not have children in the district. And then we're cultivating those senior families who were from last year, who had graduating seniors. We're trying to keep those emails to keep them connected. And then we also have 22,000 people in our volunteer database, so we send it to them as well.
What other questions do we have on this? Kristen?
Just out of curiosity, you said you had some teachers involved in this too. And what were their initial reactions to some of these scenarios that you presented? Particularly the elementary, when they're switching from 9 o'clock to 7:45.
Yeah, I mean, one of the elementary teachers, and now, Todd, maybe you want to take that. The elementary teacher we had was already there, right?
Talking about the elementary teacher that was on our committee?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the elementary group certainly did a good job of vetting from their perspective. They had their voice there, and there were some scenarios that they didn't particularly like, and they shared that with us, and I think those are scenarios you don't see. I mean, some of the options that we had, there was a point, I think, in their mind, at least from their personal perspective as advocates, that was too early. And they voiced that at the time, and I think the group respected them and gave them some space to share that.
One of the things I'll say that I've seen in the information that Cherry Creek presents is that their elementary teachers in the move are super excited about it because they've moved their day forward. So they start earlier and end earlier. So the ramifications, the other side of that, are high school teachers will start later and end later. So there's give and take in that for any group that's doing it. But in some sense, I think about my own self. If I start my workday at 9 and work until 3 or 3:30, and I get a chance to move up until 8 and be done at 2:30 or 3 with the students, it's a different day. So I think things to weigh. But yeah, our elementary teachers, our middle school teachers, the administrators also were great at expressing scenarios they liked, scenarios they didn't like.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, and thanks for all the work on this.
Nate?
Yeah, I wondered if there was, or generally in terms of elementary start times, do we see communication among elementary school teachers and administrators between schools, like with the 7:45 start time, how that works versus the later start times? Is there any anecdotal information about whether the 7:45 school experiences hardships because of that?
We did discuss the range of when we were talking in the room, we asked Matt a lot of questions, frankly, about, how far would one starting at 7:45, what would be the distance between that starting time and the starting time of another elementary, just to consider coordination. The reality is, we're going to set our meeting times. There's very few things they would do where that time would matter a great deal. Probably the one that's most obvious would be if we had a shared meeting, or we had something at the end of the day. There might be some. As far as communication between the schools, we really don't see any issues with that. And I'm not sure that
I guess I meant like how the students are doing,
I see what
how
you're saying.
student performance or attitude or whatever, the culture. Is there a big difference between a 7:45 school or the one? Is there only one?
Yeah, we just have an early one, and that's iStone.
iStone, yeah.
I think the iStone, we had an iStone teacher on the staff, which was or on the committee, which was great, because they could give that perspective. And her position was, that's the way they've always done it. They really don't notice anything different. That's the normal that they've grooved into, and most schools, when they get their starting time, will ultimately land there. We don't have anything, Nate, that says that something's better than the other, at least not right now.
Okay. I'm glad that you talked about having a polling survey person with some expertise in that. So hopefully that will make our second survey very helpful in terms of information. And then I did want to address a concern that I've heard from several people, that they question whether later secondary school start times are appropriate, because we need to get these kids ready for the workforce, and they need to be able to get up earlier. And my sense is that an 18 or 19 or 20 or 22-year-old mind and body is different than a 15 or 16-year-old, and there can be a lot of difference. I mean, is that concern something that was thought about and addressed?
I guess I would answer the question this way, Nate. I would say we hear that about lots of things we do in education. We got to get them ready for the real world. And I would challenge us in this environment and say, I think we got to get kids ready for where they are. We got to allow students to be who they are today. Yes, we want to get them ready for life after PSD. But if in fact we find out that later sleep time allows our kids to do better in school, it feels like we might be preparing them better for life after PSD. So it's hard for me to say that they're going to have to go out and work. I was just with someone the other day that said, look, I had to go out and milk the cows at 5 in the morning when I was growing up. And that's true. We had lots of people that had to do that. The reality is we know different information now, and we know that the sleep rhythm that the adolescent gets in is different. And if we think about doing work in the early morning that's repetitive, that's a whole lot different than asking them to think deeply about information and do real academic work. And so analyzing that and trying to make a decision feels important and pertinent. And we didn't have the research to support it 10 or 15 years ago that today we do. So I hear those things also, Nate, that what the real world is calling for is students who can do whatever they're asked or get up and get ready to go. We also hear them say they want kids that are able to critically think and collaborate. And so putting them in a situation when they're with us where they can practice that the best, that might be the decision we are charged with and that we have to make. And some people will be frustrated with that because they'll think we're being too soft on kids. I don't know that I agree with that professionally.
How about Carolyn or Susan? Do you have any final questions or comments? Okay. Any other questions on this subject? All right. And I would just make the comment, we all heard that we're on a bit of a timeline, so I would ask us, as we do have concerns, questions, that we find a way to get them through in a hurry, or let Susan or me or Dr. Smizer know, and us get the questions answered promptly. So thank you. Incredible amount of work was put into that. I appreciate everything that was done. So.